We're back on the build this weekend. It's the next weekend. This is September 21st, I believe. And the plan is still to have the boat at the mess bout. I know it doesn't look all that ready, but this weekend we're going to make some big progress. I am going to get the seat tops glued down in the cockpit because I need to finish the coamings, and I can't do that without the seat tops on. This morning I went ahead and dry fit my cockpit sole, and this is the first time the sole has been in the boat other than dry fitting it when I did the very first bulkhead assembly, and so now it has all the structure underneath so you can actually stand on it. And I really wish I had done this earlier in the build, because stepping in between all the longitudinal bulkheads in the tank has been really cumbersome. And so you can see also I made one mistake. Sticking through there, you'll see a corner of the fiberglass flange, and I put all my flanges on this side of the longitudinal bulkhead here and here. And the reason I did that was because the trunk takes up part of this bay, and so I thought, well, I'll put the glass flange on the other side so I have more equal spans to support. And so we already thought of that in the plans, and it shows to do it on the other side for exactly this reason. But it's not a big deal. I'm gonna just cut away that part of the fiberglass, and I will put another piece, a short piece, on this side to correct that. But these holes are cut out for the Armstrong deck hatch that I don't have one here in front of me. But there's also a trim ring that goes underneath. In fact, I'll show you that. Here's the trim ring. So this gets glued underneath each of those holes. Glues underneath that, and that adds some meat under there for the hatch toggle to grab onto. So it's really nice now standing in there. So the parts that we need to paint before we can glue the seat tops on include this locker here, which is at the very bottom of the port bunk. I'm going to be painting all in here, probably painting some in here, although I haven't decided, but this area in particular is going to be very hard to access. And I think we've decided not to paint the solid wood, just the plywood, and that way it'll leave some bright work in the cabin. And also I think in the cabin we're going to be painting all the plywood except for the stringers, the deck beams, and the hanging knees, although it's not totally decided yet, we're still debating. But we are going to leave some wood in the cabin. And then on this side, you can see I've added two more pieces of wood here and here. These are going to be supporting the edges of the cutout in the seat top, the cutout for the cooler box. And without those are just 3/4 inch cleats. Without those in there, the edges of the seat top are just sitting on foam. So if you really put your heel down into them, you might be able to, dent them a little bit. The foam is still relatively squishy, and even with the fiberglass over it on the inside, you can still press your finger into it if you really wanted to. But it's strong enough to do the job. So I put some cleats here just to help support the edges of the cutout, and I just routed out the foam with a router with a straight edge as a guide, and I just glued those down in there, put a straight edge across to make sure they were flush and flat with the surrounding cleats and stuff. And so the starboard side, I just need to decide if I'm going to paint this or not, and if I'm not, then the starboard side is pretty much ready for the seat top to be glued down. And also another thing that I had thought about was running wires aft to a future electric motor, which I'll talk more about in future videos, but we've been doing some deep diving on electric motors and battery setups and that sort of thing. Might not be a this year project, but in the future I definitely want to have an electric motor. And so if we do have an electric motor and we keep the batteries in the cabin, we're going to need to run wires aft, And it's difficult to do that through the port side because the trunk is in the way. Although you can run wires across the top of the bridge deck and then across through here. Although it's maybe a longer run possibly, but another option is to just come through the cooler, and there's 4 inches of foam right here. So with a long auger bit, you could just bore a hole straight through the foam near the plywood and have a nice big wire channel. We'll have the wire come out here, maybe work your way around the back of the hatch aft to a motor. Of course, you could also put batteries in the back of the boat, but basically, because I can drill through the cooler whenever I want, I'm not worried about trying to run a conduit or anything. I'm gonna just worry about that later. Sunday morning, and I didn't do a lot of filming yesterday because I had Taylor helping me, so I was trying to really get a lot done. But you can see I've got the the cleat for the top of the shear clamp there glued on both sides, and I didn't quite match the angle here, but I'll fill it in a little bit. And you can see the kerf cuts in that piece. There's a lot of squeeze out I need to clean up here because I had so many clamps on it that I really couldn't clean up all the squeeze out. And you can see we've got this locker painted. This is the locker that's opposite the cooler, and this one's going to be impossible to paint once the seat tops are on. I just finished sanding and prepping all these top gluing surfaces for the seat tops, so this is what the boat looks like right before we glue the seat tops down. The tops of these cleats are mostly bare wood, although some are coated, and I'm going to use a foam roller to roll a coat of epoxy on the tops of all the cleats, and then I'll use a plastic bag to squeeze out my thickened epoxy over all these edges, and I'll use a notched trowel here where there's a flat surface that I need to do a larger area. And also yesterday we glued in the anchor locker. So there's the anchor locker, and Taylor put fillet and fiberglass around it. We didn't bother with peel ply there, we're just going to do a fill coat. And we've got the last little corner glued fiberglass up in here inside the anchor well. I also put a strip of fiberglass on the deck right on the seam because I don't want there to be any chance of a little crack opening up. You'll remember we've got a butt block underneath this, and I'll have to fair this tape in, but on my Corsound 17 I got a little crack, and I notice occasionally on the forum somebody asks this question, they get a little crack in the foredeck, so I just went ahead and put a piece of glass there. We also put one there which will be under the garage top, so not really as critical, but nonetheless we put one there. And I used a Japanese saw to take the rough edge off of my cabin top while Taylor was doing other things. And I'll show you quickly my paint. This is the paint we used. It's a Duvo Devthane 379. It's a 2-part polyurethane gloss enamel, and they make it in black and white, so obviously this is the white. It's a 4-to-1 mix ratio by volume, but what we did and what I like to do to make it easier is we just used a gram scale and we weighed out equal parts of part A and part B and calculated that it was 0.226 to 1 mix ratio by weight. So then using that we created a little cheat sheet, so when you're mixing, if you want a 200-gram mix, you need 45.2 grams of the part B, and so we just tare the scale every time we add the component. That's easier to me, and also we didn't have any graduated mixing cups, so that's how we were mixing it. I wasn't using any thinner, and I've found with this paint that if you're going to do things like the cockpit lockers, you can get away without thinner, and you can just use a regular old paintbrush. It's definitely a thicker paint. It goes on pretty thick. This took us 2 coats, and we applied the second coat about an hour and a half late after the first coat. The first coat didn't quite cover all the way, but it doesn't show up on the camera really well, but this is a very glossy, smooth coating. This is the same paint I use to paint my Corson 17, and it's my go-to 2-part polyurethane paint for anything that I don't need a color for, like inside a locker or a tank or anything like that. It's much cheaper than All Grip. It is, you know, the isocyanate paint, so it's hazardous to your health. You have to wear a respirator, and we set up all the box fans we have as well as our charcoal filter fans to exhaust the garage. Plus yesterday was a beautiful day, so we had all the garage doors open and we were not using this stuff all trapped up in the garage. And the other thing I did yesterday is I prepped the seat tops. Last night I put the last coat of thin epoxy on the underside of the seat tops, so this epoxy is still green, and I'm going to glue it down to the boat just like it is now. I decided to cut my aft seat top into thirds. So I made a cut here and here, and I went ahead and glued the aft piece on to the forward piece using the butt blocks from the kit. These gaps here and here and here are for the beams, so that joint is going to be like here, here, here. And you could do this in stages. You could put down the front half of the seat top, and then you could clamp the butt blocks in place, and then you could glue the aft part separately. The reason I cut it into thirds is because I'm not finished with the anchor well, and I didn't want the seat top part that went across the middle of the boat installed yet. And I can't do the coamings unless the entire seat top is installed all the way to the transom. So by cutting this back piece into thirds, I'm able to work on the port and starboard sides of the seat tops. I can finish installing the coaming, but I don't have to fill in this center section yet. So when I'm ready to do that, I'll just install additional butt blocks here and fit the center piece. So this is the whole seat top upside down, so I'm going to flip it over to put it in the boat. Also yesterday we glued together the last of the finger joints from the kit, which are for the coamings. You can see finger joint there, and this is the cap to the coaming. And I did that with some clamps, and I put it out in the sun, and it kicked off in about an hour. And so those are going to be ready to dry fit today once the seat top glue hardens up, and I'll be able to trim this cleat here. I'll glue the cleat down on the seat tops, which will support the lower edge of the cockpit coaming. And if I run out of stuff to do, I'll run to Lowe's and get my ballast tank plumbing and valves and stuff so I can start doing that. So yeah, that's what we're going to do today. The plan is to flip the boat over next weekend because we got to get the bottom done. So once we get the coamings on, we'll be one step closer. So this is the last time probably you will see the boat without seat tops. Okay, the seat tops are all installed now, and if I could do it over again, I would have mixed smaller batches. We're using the fast hardener from B&B, and on this side I pumped like 27 pumps, which I think is about 27 ounces all at once, and mixed it and I put the thickened epoxy, and I used an icing bag to distribute it, but it was definitely getting hot in the bag. Everything went okay, but that was a little bit too much at a time. And I spent a fair amount of time cleaning up the squeeze out, especially under this area. I didn't spend as much time cleaning out squeeze out under here, although I did do some. But with cleaning up the squeeze out, you kind of need to do all or nothing, because when it mushes out, it creates a bead of epoxy. Let me see if I can show you. I'll have to get a light in there, but it creates a bead, and as soon as you touch the bead, you create, you can create stalactites and stuff that are going to poke you. So I didn't do a lot of cleaning up in here, but what I did do was just reaching through the cockpit hatch to do it. These clamps here are being used to hold the little pointy end of the hatch up under the seat top and keep those squished down into here. And then this little screw was put in initially when I was first putting some clamps on, just to keep this edge down. Predominantly what I am using is finish nails, and I would just press down to get it squeezed out and then tap a finish nail in, and that keeps pressure down on the panel. I found that I didn't need anything on the outboard edge. When I pushed it down, it squeezed out and then it just stayed there. If you push it down and it squeezes out and it stays there, you really don't have to do anything beyond that. But I got squeeze out everywhere, and just looking at that gap, sometimes the gaps creep back up on you, but that one I think is fine. And over here I had to use a fair amount of epoxy around here. This is the coaming just being dry fitted in place. So that's my next job, is to fit the cleats and stuff for that cockpit coaming. And back here I installed the butt block, and let me show you that. Okay, there's the butt block connecting the two halves of the seat tops, and I've got some screws right down the middle. Those screws are keeping these edges flush, and there was a little bit of a gap here, and I put all the thickened epoxy on the butt block, and when I tightened the screws down, it's shot up through the cracks, and then I cleaned it up. There's a little more that came up that I need to clean. And then of course I cleaned it up down on the inside, and I did a pretty decent job cleaning all the squeeze out up under here, which I recommend. Okay, we're working on the coaming now, and I've got the starboard side fitted. I'm starting to fit it all in place, and I've got the coaming cleat down here, down fitted to the boat, and I've been working on this top piece here. So if we look at the plans for the coaming, there it is. Okay, so there's a lower cockpit coaming cleat. That's what I'm putting in now. This is the piece that's already been glued in, and this piece fits up against that cleat at the bottom, and then the cap, you can see the cap sits on top of the shear strake but on the inside of the coaming. So the way this works is we put this cleat on, then we put the backrest coaming piece in, and we temporarily screw it to the edge of the cap, and we trim the top cleat. Then we get this dry fitted, then we pull this off and glass tape this inside corner, and that turns this into one piece, and then that single piece is glued against this cleat, the top cleat, and a vertical cleat along the bulkhead all at once when it's installed. So if you come over here, I'll show you my cleat section. So here is the cleat. This is the angle of the backrest, so this cleat is sitting behind this panel here, and I put a 30-degree bevel on the outboard side just to eliminate some material. And so that's the cleat that's sitting down in here, and I was able to temporarily secure it down to the cockpit with screws that all go into something else. So back here it goes into the aft beam, then I've got a screw here that lines up with the cockpit coaming, and another one in front of that that also lines up with the cockpit coaming. And then moving forward, I've got 2 more screws that are going into the foam through the plywood, so they're not going to need any filling or anything. And then on the very forward end, the screw goes into the beam across the companionway bulkhead. So that's good, but I did make one mistake, which you can see here. I had to move my screw because the first place I had it on the top here, the head of the screw kept the coaming side from touching. So I went in from behind at a bit of an angle like that, and so that's something to watch out for. So these are all just temporary screws that will help me locate that lower cleat when I glue it down. And once that cleat was on, I installed a vertical cleat on the bulkhead, which in this case is a triangle, but doesn't have to be a triangle. And I just fitted that down below. There's a screw down in here holding it, and up here I had a screw, but then again I realized my screw head was going to interfere with trimming the top, so I took that out. So the cockpit side, the part you lean against, is attached to that cleat with a screw about every 2 feet or so, and that's just keeping it in position. And now we have the cap, and the cap fits on top, obviously, and it sits on, let me go to the back here, the cap is going to sit on the shear strake and that cleat, and then the backrest is going to come up against it like such. And so the problem is getting this top cleat trimmed so that that will be the case. And so I've got a couple of tools that I made. Here's one of them. This is like a tester stick. So if you put this across here, you can use that to gauge the angle of the outboard cleat. And so this is just a 1/4 inch step down representing the top cap, and I can slide this along to check my angle of my of the bevel of this outboard cleat here. Now I could use a plane to do the back section, and I came up with this thing here, which is just a block of wood screwed to, clamped actually to my plane. And so if I can do this one-handed, so basically the plane rides like that, and the plane is set by the height of this piece, and because this cleat is actually sort of twisting as it goes back, at the aft end it's nearly horizontal. I think somebody asked me about that the other day. And then it rotates out from horizontal up until it's about the same angle as the deck. It is the same angle as the deck. Now the forward end, you can't use a plane because it's curved. So what I did instead is I carefully used a mini grinder. Now if you use a mini grinder, you have to be careful because you don't want to lose the reference edge of the plywood. The plywood edge is the fair edge, and so we don't want to gouge into it. So what I did is, as I was going along with the mini grinder, I was using the inside edge of the glue line. As soon as the grinder got down to that inside edge of the glue line, that meant that I was done. And so to use the grinder, I was just skimming along the top of this cleat, keeping the end of the grinder approximately 1/4 inch below the backrest coaming. And I did that all the way, the length all the way up to there, and it did a pretty decent job. And now I'm coming back with some sandpaper on a flexible board to fair this cleat out. I can feel a couple of little high spots, so I'm going to work on those a little bit and make sure that it goes on fair. But as long as you keep that plywood edge when you're trimming this, it should all work out. So I pretty much got this side done, so I'm going to attach the cap temporarily, then we'll pop this and the cap off. It can be filleted and glassed, and then I can glue this cleat down to the cockpit seat top and the vertical cleat on the companionway bulkhead. And then we're going to decide whether we want to put a bulkhead here or not. I think we are. And then we'll put the cubby hole, and we might put a second cubby hole. We haven't decided yet. So get that done on the other side, but that's just a little shot of fitting this cockpit coaming cleat. It's definitely a little bit of a challenging aspect of the build, but it all lines up if you take your time. Here it is with the coaming cap put in, and I just screwed into the edge grain. Sometimes you get one that you can tell the screw is raising the grain a little bit, but if it bothers you, you can put some like bamboo skewers in the holes to plug up the hole. And if you don't think you can hit the center of 1/4-inch plywood with a screw, you can always do this kind of a thing. And mine kind of had a little issue at the forward end. The cap flipped from being next to the backrest to being on top of, and that's actually because I had to trim some off the bottom because my seat top had a little bit of a high spot here, and that was because my bulkhead number 3 cleat ended up a little bit higher than the cleats along the side of the hull, but not a big deal. We can fill that in with thickened epoxy, and you can see it matches the deck pretty well, and it does need to be sprung into place. So when I glue it down, I'll spring it to there. But at this stage, the cap and the backrest can be taken off the boat and filleted and glassed on the inside, this edge up in here, and then I will glue that cleat down to the bottom, and then it's all got to get coated in there. So it's about as much as I can do as far as the dry fit goes. Okay, this is where we're going to leave it for Sunday night. Taylor got these cockpit coamings all glassed and coated. That joint that I've used the screws to hold. So you can see the screws are still there, and she put a fillet and glass on there and put a coat. So we'll get another coat on maybe this week. Here's the port side. And while she was doing that, I got the cleats glued on, this cleat as well as the vertical cleat on both sides. And I think what we decided to do is we're going to put a partial bulkhead, well, I guess it's a whole bulkhead here, right at the middle of the cooler, and also one at the middle of the hatch. There's going to be a cubby here and another cubby here. This one will be nice because you can maybe put like the tail end of the main sheet you could stuff in there. This one, just for general storage, sunscreen and stuff, that'll be underneath the Dodger. And then the aft section will have accessible from the stern, and that could maybe fit a short like trolling fishing rod, or some spare battens or who knows what. But we're not planning to ever store an oar in here. I just don't think the boat is going to ever be rowed. The cockpit, the coamings are so high that rowing is really going to be difficult. For the Everglades Challenge, what I plan to do is try to fit a Mirage drive in the well. I think it'll fit right in there. So that's where we're going to leave it for Sunday, and hopefully this week we'll get the coamings installed, and so for next weekend we'll be ready to flip the boat over and get the bottom done. So thanks for watching.